Good afternoon and welcome to CIPR TV on Wednesday the 2nd of March, live at 5. I'm Philip Sheldrake and I'm joined in the studio by my co-host Stephen Waddington.
Hello.
Today we're talking to Neil Chapman, founder of Alpha Voice Communications. Welcome, Neil.
Hello.
Neil recently left BP. What? Yeah, please.
It's my bit.
Yeah, you go for it.
Neil recently left BP after 17 years, where his most recent role was in the Unified Command Center in the US, set up to respond to the Deepwater Horizon explosion and the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to be talking to Neil about the communication response to Deepwater Horizon and the role of traditional and social media in a crisis communication effort. You can talk now.
I can go for it. Excellent. We've already had lots of questions in via Twitter at #CIPR TV. Also live via the box at the bottom of your player at the moment. And for the very first time, we're streaming live to the CIPR's Facebook page, live in the wall, allowing you to interact with the wall, post your comments and questions there as well. I think Marketers 4DC assert it's a first.
Neil, welcome. It's great to have you here.
You.
Thanks very much for coming. I'm going to kick off. We've got loads of questions to get through today.
Okay.
I wanted to start there. You trained originally as a journalist.
Absolutely.
How did you land at BP? What's the
just
career
through
path?
various corporations, finally going from being a poacher to a gamekeeper, so to speak, joining the corporate world and realising the challenge is just as great in terms of communications as for a reporter is telling stories and telling the story around corporations and what they do and the good that they do.
So, talking about Facebook and the first time we're on Facebook, we actually have a first question in from Portugal.
Oh, okay.
Via our wall. From Margarida Gamiero. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Here in Portugal, most PR professionals make the mistake of not necessarily planning for a crisis, but just reacting to one when it occurs.
Right.
Which prompts us to ask, what are the essential ingredients for a crisis plan?
Well, any plan has got to address the problems that you might face, but the key to any plan, and I'm not going to say what you have to put in there, the key, I think, is practicing and understanding the roles and responsibilities that communicators have. And practice is key to it, because when it comes to it, no one sits down and starts reading the plan when they're faced with a crisis. They've got to know what to do and almost do it instinctively. So training, preparing are really critical. And you don't suddenly get good at being running a crisis or an emergency. It's not just you've got to practice for it. It's something I think is very important for day-to-day business as well.
Let's focus on the job you were doing last year at Deepwater Horizon. How can you possibly plan and for something like that?
Well, it's key that you do plan. But to have such a huge event, it's very difficult to do that. But I can tell you the energy industry is at the forefront in terms of how it practices and plans. For example, I can tell you that in the United States, I've taken part in what are known as exercises, spills of national significance, where many, many agencies come together who would be responding to a crisis, an oil spill. They may run more than a couple of days, and many agencies are involved in that. And for many years ago, I was involved in a spill exercise with another company, and it lasted a whole week. So the energy industry does prepare and prepares better than most. But I think that demonstrates a very good lesson for communicators, is you have to understand the framework and the system through which any incident you might be involved in with other agencies, how it be run.
Well, that's a great segue then to the question we have in here from, and I'll try and pronounce this one correctly as well, at Carrie Tresvarg.
Right.
How would you evaluate, in hindsight, BP's crisis comms performance?
Oh, the crisis communications performance, I'd say it was very, very good. It's very impressive in some parts. In others, and unfortunately that's how the way the world judges you, is, well, it wasn't so good. Now, I think what is important for communicators to do is look behind the headlines and say, well, what did BP do well? Don't just take some of the bad headlines. What would we have done differently? And I can tell you there are a number of companies looking very closely at this and saying, okay, we can learn the lessons from this event very cheaply. We don't have to be, it doesn't have to be as expensive as it was for BP.
Because it's difficult, I imagine, to tease out the difference between the fact that people don't like the fact that the crisis has happened in the first place from the how well did BP manage the communications around the crisis. It's difficult in your mind to distinguish between the two.
Well, you can't PR away what is essentially, at the beginning of this, it was a human tragedy in which 11 people died, and that drove a lot of people who were involved in the response, because they very felt that very deeply, and I did as well. But I don't think we'd be sitting here talking about the event if it hadn't turned into be a large environmental disaster. But a large spill that was going on for day after day after day, and that was the difference here, I think, in the sense that it wasn't an event that suddenly happened and then you dealt with the results, although that was the case with the explosion. What was a new dimension in this crisis was the fact that it was going on and no one could see the end of it at some points. And so there was this almost unending flow of oil, but there was also an unending demand for information and work for communicators to try and to meet that demand, to give good information to the people who were being impacted by this event.
I suppose you also had this situation where this event was unfolding in real time. Yeah. Also the media operating not to daily deadlines, but in absolute real time. What were some of the lessons you learned from that, dealing with the interest from social media?
And that coincides with a Twitter question from @Sarah Stables.
Well, let me take the media, in the sense that you've got to be very clear on the messages, and we had 4 messages that we were very clear on from the beginning, that we had to attack the source, we had to clean the oil and on the water, we had to defend the shore, and then restore people's lives on shore. So they were a quite simple way of encapsulating the messages. What is important is that there's not a lot you can say that makes things better, but there's a lot you can say that can make it worse. And so the importance there is to stick to message. Describe to people what you are doing and what actions you're taking. And frankly, over that period of time, what was very difficult to constantly be saying is, this is what we're doing. I know it's taking a lot longer than you want. I know the anger is is growing and the frustration is growing. But this is what we are doing. And as we went down the road, one of the good things that came out of it, I think, was when BP was describing the technical challenge in much, much clearer detail as it went on, with graphics, with a very good communicator, a senior leader, who stood up there and would describe what the plans going forward were.
So you're saying, I think, that the role was less placation, but more public information.
Well, I would say the role of any communicator in any crisis is to provide good information, accurately and in a timely fashion. You're no different from the person who is trying to source boom or place the boom in the right place. But you've got to source good information and get it to the right people. That's the challenge.
And it's even more of a challenge when you're not the only organisation involved. I mean, we've got a cracking question here from Pamela. Pamela Mounter. BP was not the only company involved in the tragedy. How well, if at all, did communication with your opposite numbers in the other companies work?
I can tell you I've been involved in other crises and many other exercises preparing for these events. And I can tell you what really drove the people, all from different agencies, many of whom had never worked together, even if they were from the same agency, was that fundamental thing. They knew that 11 people had been killed in this tragedy. And the amount of work, teamwork, was far beyond than anything I've ever seen before. People had a common goal. They wanted to get out good information. It wasn't, in many cases, you forgot who you worked for, because the teamwork, in order to get good information to people who are being impacted by this event, brought people together.
And so how do you deal in a situation like this with the legal issues that are inevitably going to come down? You want to communicate candidly, but equally you don't want to put the company into a potentially legal vulnerable position.
Well, it's interesting. I think there's always this idea that the communicators and the lawyers are at loggerheads. Yeah. I've never found that. I was very lucky in the sense that the BP lawyers, the corporate lawyers, are very good. They're some of the best I've ever worked with. And I always was able to turn to counsel, and they would help. They knew that our goal was to get good information out in a timely fashion, accurate information, and they had that goal as well. Obviously, there are some legal implications, and you had to check with them. But I can tell you that after the explosion at Texas City one time, when BP very quickly accepted responsibility for the event, and a lot of lawyers were saying, "Ooh, was that the best thing?" I heard some say that. Years down the road, I asked legal counsel at the trial, was that a help or a hindrance? And they said it was a great help, because it took the whole idea of responsibility off the table. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting.
It's inevitable that we will have a question coming in about Tony Hayward.
Right.
We have a question here from Stephen White. And it'd be interesting to see if you actually agree with the phrasing of the question.
Okay, all right.
It became pretty clear through the campaign that Tony Hayward was too prone to straying off message and making flippant remarks. How difficult was it coaching the CEO and getting him to communicate in a way that was more appropriate?
Well, I wasn't actually involved in coaching Tony Hayward, but let me just answer it from, first of all, as a former employee of BP, and also then looking at sort of slightly subjectively from outside. Objectively.
Yeah, I knew what you meant.
I was subjectively objective. I had a tremendous admiration for him. Very quickly, Tony Hayward said, "I'm going to lead from the front." And he has to look after employees and tell them what the company is doing about this event. He went down there himself. He made sure that the technical resources were available. He made sure the financial resources were available for people to get on and do the job they needed to do. And he was down there personally encouraging people. What inevitably happened then, as a human being, he gets sucked into the event, gets very frustrated, very tired, under a lot of pressure, and then he's remembered, having done 400 or 500 interviews, he's remembered for the one or two where I think, as any human being would say, come out with something that demonstrates that frustration and pressure, and he's remembered for those, which I think is grossly unfair, but that's life. That is life, and that's the life of a CEO. Looking at it objectively, yes, it comes down to, as I said, there's not much you can say that makes it better, but there's a lot you can say that makes it worse. Yeah. You've got to stick on message. Yeah. And I can tell you that's all the communications people I knew were desperately keeping on message, building up trust, talking to people, saying, what are we doing about it, even in the face of their frustration, because all they wanted to hear from the company was, we fixed the problem.
Yeah. It's a question in from Laurie Seacrest, who asks about the preparation of a spokesperson in a situation, and this is, I suppose, is an extreme example where we're used as communicators to being able to coach executives for interview situations. Yet here the interviews are coming so fast. Yeah. Particularly when the politicians start getting involved. How do you coach someone like Tony Hayward to deal with the amount of media interviews that he had to deal with? Specific question from Laurie. She said, "Do you know if a type of murder board was used?" Now, I hadn't heard that expression.
Murder board,
I've not heard of a murder board myself.
Fortunately, Wikipedia has, and it describes it as a panel of people who interview a spokesperson in advance to, I guess, fire all the possible awkward questions you can possibly imagine, so that by the time they go out there, they're ready to answer appropriately.
Right. Then I've not heard of that, but although I've taken part in that sort of panel previously, prior to this event, I think it shows that, as I learned during this event, and it's something for everyone to learn, is when you have a crisis, it's not the communicators and the operational people. Everybody has communicator in their job title. Yeah. Everybody. The 45,000 people involved in this response. Every one of them had that. Even if they were down on the beaches, we had to make sure that when the media turned up, they knew, and that didn't always get through very easily, but they knew that they had the right to talk to the press about what they were doing. All the way up to Tony Hayward, who obviously was going to be the spokesperson for the company. But most of the interviews and most of the communication was going on down on the beaches and the bayous, and many of the interviews, which people haven't heard of, but were talking to people locally through regional TV, through local radio, were being done by the host of communicators who just went out and did it because they're well trained, they've got a lot of experience.
So complex, so complex. So I should just say that we are already halfway through the show. In fact, we're well into the second half. And just to remind you that you can tweet away to your heart's content with #CIPRtv, and also now on the Facebook wall as well. And we'll jump now to a contribution via Twitter from @LexLacey, an ex-colleague of mine. In fact, would you agree that you weren't prepared for the onslaught and impact of social media within the crisis? Was this personally the first crisis that you had experience on with social media?
Oh,
no.
sorry. No, personally,
Yeah.
no. It's something I'd followed quite a lot in the run-up to that.
Okay.
In terms of social media, you're right. It's the first major event where social media played a part. It was not a social media crisis, as has happened to other companies, but social media played a large part in terms of how the interaction between mainstream media and how people were interacting with the company and the organisations that had the information. I think it demonstrates the challenges that there are in trying to monitor what's going on, because so much of the coverage, so much of the conversation was online. But at the same time, it gives you an opportunity, and that's where I think BP had to get smart very quickly in recognising how it could use the channels which it probably hadn't learned a lot about before this event, was to how to use them to get the message out. And I think the single lesson from that is don't wait till a crisis to start learning about the new world of communications. And it's not just social media, it's digital communications as well, I think.
Yeah, we've got to ask at this point about the parody BP accounts that appeared on Twitter. You ignored them. Was that the right move?
I think so. I think others have said they would have done it differently. I was asked that live on TV, and that's how I learnt about it. And I said, well, this is something you have to deal with. And frankly, if your job is to fix an oil leak deep under the Gulf of Mexico, complaining or saying, oh, that Twitter feed should not be there. I mean, come on, there are far more important things to do than that. But you've got to recognise that's something you have to deal with now.
Yeah, it's part of the new media communication landscape, right?
And it was part of a discussion that we had with some legal counsel to say, look, guys, these new channels can change the game in the sense that things have got to be far more transparent, and yet at the same time we do have to meet the stock exchange rules, and there was very long discussions, deep discussions about, well, how does this change this? You can learn about these things beforehand.
So for CIPR members who are looking back at the BP crisis as a potential case study now for how to approach crisis communications in the future, I think the question is articulated beautifully by D. McIntosh, who says simply, so what would you have done differently in the situation now that, with the benefit of hindsight?
I think from a corporate point of view, what you should do is understand how the communications landscape is changing, how broader it is. And we've talked about social media. Just understanding, I mean, we're seeing what's happening in the Middle East. That should not be a surprise to anyone. Some of the differences in the way people are communicating amongst themselves, the speed, the different communications technologies they're using, and the whole issue of transparency. I think that's an issue that corporations have really got to start to understand how it can impact them, but at the same time how they can use it. Because suddenly they can get into the publishing business themselves very quickly, very easily, to get their messages out. It doesn't always have to go through the filter of the media. They have to take care of the media, but at the same time they can publish directly on their websites as BP did during this particular crisis.
One of the takeaways from the crisis for me was, for the first time you saw everybody that had lots of people with an interest in how BP was dealing with this situation, actually calling it to account, very publicly via Twitter, via blogs, and previously those individuals wouldn't have had a voice, and presumably that's exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, you discovered how people had, a voice. It didn't matter where they were; they could use that voice.
In fact, a great contribution to this very debate from @Jason Wassel or Vassal, depending on how you pronounce it. Simply, everyone has to be a communicator. Exactly, because modern crisis is so complex, it cannot be kept just within the comms team. Your point almost exactly, isn't it? Everyone has to know what the organisation is doing, what the state of play is.
Well, I think it's a case of communications and good communications by leaders is so important from a day-to-day point of view. That's I think the lesson.
So what about the political angle? Ultimately, Obama got involved. He's quite a powerful chap. How do you deal with the way he was responding and talking to camera in ways that just actually made BP out to be, well, evil?
You've got to understand the system, and in fact, that's again where the United States government is in charge, And that became an issue for the US government, is that many people thought, sorry, who is in charge here? Is it the US government? And the head of the country is President Obama, and he had to make sure that people understood that we were acting, but only at the behest of the US government. And he had to make that absolutely clear. And any actions we took had to be passed by the US government agencies, and we had to explain them, they had to understand them, and then we could only take actions as a result of them saying, yes, you can do that, using dispersants or on the plans that we put together. So again, it goes back to that lesson. You have to understand the system under which you will, if you find yourself as a corporation or an organization in a crisis, who is calling the shots? In what sort of framework do you find yourself, and what sort of roles and responsibilities do you have if you find yourself as the responsible party, as BP was, because it was responsible because it owned the oil. So it's very important that you understand that, and understand that and explain that you as a company only take action as a result of being able to explain it, and the authority saying, yes, you can do that.
Well, we are actually running slightly over time, but there's so many great questions coming through. I hope you don't mind if we still find a bit more time to put some to you. We touched on internal communications before, specifically to BP, but when you're planning for a crisis more generally, how should CIPR members consider the internal comms perspective for large multinational, multi-time zone organisations such as BP? Well,
BP is very lucky. It does have, like many other corporations, journalists and reporters who have, they write for the website, they write for the publications, etc. And BP deployed some people down onto the Gulf in order to give a very personal perspective. They launched a blog, for example, and they would report back on what they were seeing. So everyone internally had access to all the external channels, but at the same time they could read personal perspectives from people who were down there. And I think that helped give a lot of people the understanding of what their fellow employees were going through. I think that's important, that people don't just get the official information, they understand the human element because they are fellow employees. But at the same time, there was a lot of briefing going on by senior leaders to other parts of the business, because it is a global business. And you saw some really good examples of leadership, and communication was so important to keep people feeling informed and understanding what was going on, because they were impacted, didn't matter where they were in the world, they were being impacted directly by it. And I think BP did a very good job of that, and if I remember, there was a survey taken, and many people said, yes, we felt informed, which I think is important in the crisis. Employees are often forgotten in many incidents.
We have one more question.
A question from Nigel Smith, actually, great question. So during the crisis, we've talked about how BP responded, we've talked about the US government, we've talked about consumers. We haven't talked about some of the public sector agencies and how they use social media to communicate, various forms of media, but mainly social media, to communicate with their constituencies. And perhaps there's something we can learn from the way they use social media here in the UK as the public sector goes through the changes it does.
Well, I would say, just touching on it, I think it's a very good question, because I'd urge anyone in the public sector to look at what's happening in the US. The social media is being used very effectively, and I'll tell you this, that one of the most impressive organisations who were using it in a very effective way, I was working very closely with them, was the US Coast Guard.
Right.
I mean, they are really top-notch in how they use social media and understanding it. And I'd encourage anyone to go and read what Admiral Thad Allen, who was the incident commander leading the event there, what he wrote in the Harvard Business Review afterwards around what social media means now going forward. So look at how it's being used by many public sector organisations, including the military in the US. And I think there's some great examples in this country as well, but we're maybe a little bit behind that. So I think it's a great question, and there's some great examples out there. And one of the examples is the use, for example, of digital communications. The US Coast Guard use a system called PIR, Public Information Emergency Response. And if you just understand that, I think one of those sites got about 150 million hits, and it did not falter. And there was live webcasts like this one, but going out to thousands of people, with people able to Twitter in their questions. The digital challenge is a whole new area and a whole case study in itself. And just looking at the system they used and how they integrated into it, the social media platforms, very interesting case study.
So we've had 25 minutes talking about 2010.
Right.
30 seconds. What's 2011 hold for you?
For me,
yes.
I hope by the end of it I look back and say I've actually helped a number of communicators understand how they can prepare better for something which actually is a very traumatic event.
Well, great, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We are out of time. I'm back next month with Russell Goldsmith on Monday the 11th of April with a show that will be part of the CIPR's Spring Social Media Conference. We'll be joined by experts in the field of social web analytics to talk through some of the highlights from the conference and discuss the latest in web analytics.
Until then, thanks for watching. Thanks to Neil for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to the production team here at Marketeers 4DC. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.